I want to introduce our speaker, Peter Vasilopoulos. Let me give you a little information about him. He's a 40-year resident of Arlington County in Virginia. He recently retired from the federal government as Deputy Chief Information Officer at the United States Agency for Global Media. While serving 35 years at USAGM, he worked as a broadcast journalist, international television producer, and new media and information technology specialist. Prior to working at USAGM, Peter was a videographer for Cable News Network. Mr. Vasilopoulos is a board member for the Alliance to Preserve the Civil War Defenses in Washington, D.C., and he is vice president of the 3rd U.S. Infantry Reenactors. He was a member of Arlington County's Civil War Sesquicentennial Committee. He's a graduate of George Washington University and American University with master's degrees in managing information systems and international communications. Mr. Vasilopoulos is working on a master's certificate in digital humanities from George Mason University. He's also working on a public history project called Mapping the Civil War in Arlington. The project's goal is to generate a greater awareness of Arlington's military history during the Civil War. We are thrilled to have such a knowledgeable speaker that can really enlighten us on this history. So with that, I'm gonna stop my share and I'm gonna turn it over to Peter. Thank you very much for being here this evening.
Well, Kathy, thank you so much. I'll tell you what, I don't need to share at the moment. I'm just going to speak directly. Then I'll share my screen in a second. But first off, thank you all very much. I really want to appreciate Kathy for the introduction and also to the members of the Arlington Historical Society for inviting me to speak tonight. My presentation is somewhat timely because considering Monday, April 12th, marks the 160th anniversary of the attack on Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. While it has been 160 years since the start of the Civil War, the recent effort to save the Febrey-Lothrop estate has rekindled attention to what happened in Arlington and especially on Upton's Hill during the conflict. But the 160th anniversary also serves as a reminder that history is a process of discovery. And in fact, the root of the word history comes from the Greek word historia, and I think my mom would be proud that I can even say that, which originally meant inquiry or the act of seeking knowledge. But in regard to the presentation tonight, it also means the knowledge that results from that inquiry. And I think when we're going to discuss the presentation tonight, it's what we are now relearning or rediscovering. And even though the Febrey house unfortunately has been demolished, the campaign to save it was a motivating factor, especially for me. And as a result, I've gained much more insight into Upton's Hill and the surrounding area. And I think I can honestly say that in the past several months, while I've uncovered a few new things, most of the stuff that I'm uncovering are things that are known or were known, but for whatever reasons, people just have never really put all of that together. So, and then later on, I am going to present to the audience the presentation about the new website that I'm launching called Mapping the Civil War. A lot of the material that I'm presenting tonight will be on that site. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen for the presentation. Okay. So in addition to what I said already, I just want to say that I'm hopeful that discussions like tonight will continue to generate further awareness of Arlington's rich Civil War history. I know there's a lot more history associated with Upton's Hill, and back in 2009, there was the Traceries report that is worth reading that really gives a very thorough analysis. And I know that Arlington's historical group led by Cynthia Torres had put together a lot of information about Upton's Hill in the history, but I'm primarily going to be focusing on the Civil War component because that's where I spend most of my time doing historical research is on the Civil War. And I think it's important to note that Upton's Hill, as we're going to discover tonight, played a pretty significant role, not just for Arlington, but in the Civil War itself. So some of you already know this. I know the Arlington Historical Society did an article on Robert Knox Sneeden. This is probably one of the better drawings that represents Upton's Hill and Upton's house that you see with the tower, and what to the left is Fort Ramsey. I think it's important to at least start out the bat that long before the Battle of Manassas, Antietam, and Gettysburg, the real theater of war, the real conflict was here in Arlington. It was between the Confederates and the Union troops, and there was a stalemate over who was going to control Munson's and Upton's Hill. And by the way, I'm going to use the possessive because that's what people back then in the 19th century, they would say Upton's Hill. They wouldn't say Upton Hill. I know today we've kind of lost track of the origin of the name, but for the purposes of history, I'm going to be calling it Upton's Hill. So from the period of June 1861, after Union troops across the Potomac and arrive into Arlington, till about the fall of 1862, Upton's Hill was a well-known theater of war, and newspaper readers in both the North and South couldn't get enough about what was going on in Upton's Hill in the Arlington area. I just found this story today. It's interesting. This is a Delaware Inquirer newspaper, and notice the date. It's Saturday morning, September 28th. This is about at the time that Confederate troops are going to withdraw from Upton's Hill. And I think it's an interesting story because it talks about they're looking by binoculars from Ball's Crossroads, and they can see the Confederates up on Upton's Hill. And it probably just exemplifies the fact that most of the trees had already been cut down for farming. And so you could see that distance. And they're talking about seeing Confederate artillery at the top of the hill. And they're also reinforced. The correspondent goes into a little bit of story about poor, at the time, it was Congressman Upton and in his family getting run out of their house. So it's a good way to start with the fact that Upton's Hill for a long period of time was in the news. It was constantly being discussed. Today, though, we have a different perspective, and I think that's part of what I want to talk about is the history that we're rediscovering is because of the technologies that are allowing us to do that. The average person now has access to a considerable amount of historical research, including primary source materials. That newspaper article, anyone can get an account in newspaper.com and search the Evening Star and the Alexandria Gazette, the New York Times. And I'll tell you, that's exactly what I did. And it's very easy to start to see and compile dozens upon dozens of stories about Upton's Hill and the fighting that was going on there. And all this material is available. It's easy to find. And it reveals the news accounts of the day of troop movements, skirmishes, small battles in the area. And I just think that the volume of those articles and the reporting is giving a new perspective on the frequency and the intensity of the conflict in Arlington. These soldiers were going at it every day. There were soldiers, shooting at one another, and they were dying. It was not a fun place to be. Arlington was a theater of war. And I think this is a good drawing showing you that these are skirmishers and pickets, and you can see they're engaged with the enemy. Those little puffs of smoke, obviously, if you've ever fired a black powder weapon, it's not something you can hide. And so the troops on both sides were very, very visible. And also at the time, the average distance of this type of engagement was about 300 yards. So you can imagine soldiers from Ballston, Union soldiers coming down into the 4 Mile Run Valley, meeting soldiers coming from Upton's Hill. And they would have been engaging in this type of distance of about 200, 300 yards. So for well over 1 year, Upton's Hill was the advanced line of the Army of the Potomac. And I think this image, by the way, and later on, I'm going to introduce Luke Burke, who actually brought this image to my attention. I think this is a fascinating sketch because this is here in 4 Mile Run Valley. And I think if you really look carefully, you'll see the train. And that train is the Alexandria Loudon Hampshire Railroad. And that camp you're looking at is what was called Camp Upton. And these soldiers are with the 1st Ohio Regiment. They were part of the initial 75,000 troops that Lincoln called up after Fort Sumter was attacked. And you're looking at a full regiment camp, and you're looking at approximately 1,000 soldiers there. And that's not that far from the Rose Garden in Bluemont, where that camp was. And I just learned that. I didn't know that it was that extensive. And I just do think, though, it just kind of makes you want to ponder 160 years ago, there were thousands of soldiers like what they're doing right here, going on patrol and skirmishing. And by the way, we're going to talk a little bit later, but these soldiers eventually fought at the Battle of Vienna, and that's something we'll discuss. So Upton's Hill was a very strategic location, and eventually when the Union Army finally is able to move into Upton's Hill and gain control, at the time, Major General George McClellan is going to order the construction of 3 forts. And these forts, Fort Ramsey, which you saw in the earlier drawing, Fort Buffalo, which is very close to the fire station at Seven Corners, and Fort Taylor, which is near Coons Ford. They were built and they played a significant role in the defense of the capital. And I've actually uncovered some newspaper articles that on several occasions, the cannons from those forts actually fired to prevent Confederate cavalry from getting closer. So it wasn't just that these forts just were built and nothing happened. They were actively protecting, and there were engagements around the forts going on quite often. This is an interesting drawing. It's showing the construction of Fort Ramsey and other forts in the area. And these are New York soldiers that are involved here. And look in the distance, you see the tower that they built on top of poor Charles Upton's house. That was a very important site in terms of observers would go up and they wanted to peer into Fairfax. And from that tower in the drawing, they could actually see the unfinished Washington Monument, and the semaphore flag flyers would actually be able to.
This is this lecture. Let's see if we can get it to work.
Okay, yeah, I guess you got to mute. Sorry, it's a little. All right. So they would be able to communicate to people in Washington. Eventually, the telegraph found its way. One of the things that this was known, but it was new to me last summer. General Beauregard actually was quite antagonizing Confederate President Davis to attack the federal capital. This is a letter dated, as you can see, June 12th, 1861. So this is a more than a month before the Battle of Manassas. And there's Beauregard, who, by the way, is reported to have fired the first cannon at Fort Sumter. He's here now in the Arlington area, and he's itching to get into Washington, D.C. So I think it just reinforces the fact that there was a moment when Arlington, being the front line, could have been involved in a very significant and major battle. But one of the things that we know historically, that this threat, while it persisted for a while, eventually was resolved after the first Battle of Manassas, when the buildup of Union troops went significant in the Arlington area from 75,000 to 200,000. And as mentioned earlier, the 3 forts Upton's Hill was surrounded by 5 Union camps. And these Union camps were significant in terms of part of the defense and the offensive nature of the Union Army. Again, I just wanted to share with you, in addition to newspapers, there are a significant number of digital collections that are now accessible for free. And I think this is part of the history that is this digital history or public history that's making it easier now to search and put these historical facts together, to stitch together a bigger story about what was happening. You know, I can understand why decades ago people would say, well, okay, we had the Civil War forts in Arlington, we had some camps, but there wasn't that much fighting, there wasn't that much activity going on. But when you start to put all of this together with the newspaper accounts and the activities that was going on at Munson's Hill and at Upton's Hill, and basically the research that I've started on, I've been able to identify over 50 Union regiments that at one time or another in the 3-year period of time camped at Upton's Hill. And we know this because people were writing letters. They were saying on the letters, Upton's Hill, and the unit regimental histories clearly state that these units were on Upton's Hill. So this wasn't a winter camp or just a very brief period of time. This was an extended period of time from the fall of 1861 till about 1863, when most of the troops are being pulled out into the campaign in Richmond and Petersburg. And there were, again, thousands upon thousands of Union troops. And these troops were drilling and they were training. And after, you know, we all know the story of George McClellan, that was his forte. He was really into logistics. I think you're going to learn a little more about this group, the 23rd New York Volunteer Regiment. I happen to be from New York, and I'm quite amazed at the number of New York regiments that actually spent a lot of time in the Arlington area. This particular unit, the 23rd New York, they came from Elmira. So if you're from central New York, this unit has a lot of history. They participated in a skirmish. We'll talk a little more about that. That was probably one of the larger skirmishes that took place in Arlington. And these young guys, this is a very early photograph, and they happen to be holding Enfield rifles, by the way. And these guys are, note in the photograph, though, that they wear a distinctive militia jacket that was from the state of New York. And their belt buckles would have had not US, but they would have had SNY, state of New York. And their buttons were unique. And that comes into play later when we start to talk about some of the artifacts that have been found on Upton's Hill. These belt buckles, the buttons, and really just reinforces the fact that thousands of these soldiers were there. So I always like this picture because it really kind of takes back, like I started earlier, we're 160 years since the Civil War here in Arlington. And you look at these two gentlemen, and they're standing up in Roslyn overlooking Georgetown and what is the Aqueduct Bridge Road. And now you've got the modern vision of Roslyn. Can you imagine someone from the Civil War peering in and seeing what Arlington looks like today? I mean, you can't imagine how much we've grown. I mean, Arlington at the time probably had, Arlington proper, not just all of Alexandria, had about 2,000 people. And now I believe, someone can correct me, but I think it's well over 250,000. And I think when you think about the rural nature of Arlington, and now this image shows how the density, the urbanization of where we live. This is a photograph of a Camp Upton, and we can talk a little later about that, but Camp Upton was basically where Bluemont Park is today at 4 Mile Run Valley. And I just think it's fascinating. Up until about 6 months ago, I didn't even know Camp Upton existed. And Camp Upton was named for Congressman Charles Upton. And we'll talk a little bit more because a lot of people in Arlington probably didn't even know that Charles Upton was a congressman, at least for a brief moment. So at the beginning of the Civil War, Arlington, right from the get-go, was caught in the middle of a conflict. This image here basically shows you that it was not a given that Virginia was going to secede from the Union. And as you can see from this cartoon, even 160 years ago, voting and polling was a conflict. So this is an interesting, not a satire, but it's interesting that people in Virginia were threatened, and there were a lot of Unionists living in the Arlington area. These people came from the North. A lot of people moved from New York and other states, and there were a lot of what were called radical Republicans in the Arlington area, and Charles Upton was one of them. And we're going to learn more about him and his family, especially his son-in-law, Hugh Throckmorton. But at the election for the referendum, May 23rd, there were a lot of people threatened, as you can see from the bayonet sticking out of the no window. So, but nowhere more than Upton's Hill, we start to learn more about the personal stories about the people living there, like the Febrey family. You're looking at the Febrey house in this drawing, and you're looking, this was the 144th another New York regiment. And they occupied the area of the Febrey estate following the Battle of Second Bull Run. And if you remember the Febrey house, and I'll show it later, there was a section of the house that telescoped out. So you're looking at the Febrey estate on Upton's Hill from coming up the road from McKinley Elementary School. And you can just imagine, they had a large estate. At the time, I believe it was 170 acres, and sufficient land for, if you were a Union regiment, it was a perfect place. For those of you that have ever had the opportunity to see the view from where the Febrey estate is, it's a magnificent view to Ballston. And at the time, you could see well into Washington, and you can also see out to the Fairfax as well. But at this time, we're seeing the steady buildup of Union troops in the area. And one of the things that we want to make note of, and I was telling you earlier about my research on the regiments that actually stayed at Upton's Hill, one of those regiments happened to be the Ohio 23rd. And at the time, I didn't know this, but I discovered, I actually read Rutherford B. Hayes' diary. He was a colonel with the 23rd, and one of his sergeants was Sergeant William McKinley. So for the record, 2 US presidents camped at Upton's Hill, and it's worth noting. And if we ever do have a way to make a historical park or record the history, I mean, what better way to note that 2 future presidents were there at that time of the war. Later on, I'm going to share with you, but I do want, today is the public launching of a project I've been working on regarding Upton's Hill and the Civil War history in Arlington. As noted earlier, I'm a graduate student at George Mason University. It's a graduate program in digital humanities. It actually combines 2 things that I really love, which is technology, information technology, and history. And one of the things that George Mason has been very active in public history is they've developed the platform to permit historical societies and small museums to put their collections online and make them accessible. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I'm really pleased to be able to announce the launching of the site. And for those of you that I'll put it on chat, the URL of the website a little bit later. So for some of you, this might be a new photograph, but I think this is probably one of the most amazing photographs of Upton's Hill and Upton's house. And I got this photograph from Wally Owen, who used to be at C.F. Smith, and he actually was a co-author of the book, Mr. Lincoln's Forts. And this is from the inside of Fort Ramsey looking out. and Washington would have been to the right of this photograph. And I look at this photograph a lot to figure out what time of day they took this photograph. But obviously, if you know anything about Civil War photography, they had to get these guys to pose this. And it's quite interesting how they got them all to be visible. And they had to stand still for at least 10 seconds or whatever in order to capture. But note, Upton's house here is, I believe, right at the intersection of McKinley and Wilson Boulevard, which at the time, by the way, was called Aqueduct Bridge Road. But I think it's important to note that behind the house would have been the Febrey house, okay? And you can't see it in this photograph, but you can see those tents. Those are large regimental tents. And there it goes down that row, and it just shows you that that's on the Febrey property. So it's no wonder that they're finding lots of artifacts on that property, where they, or at least they did when they allowed people to metal detect on there. But I'm going to stop for a second, and I'm going to basically kind of set the stage for the next presentation, part of the presentation, which is I was trying to think of a creative way to present these different personalities that I've been uncovering as part of the research. And again, it's not that I found something mysterious and new. It's just that it's putting this all together because we're trying to focus on the Civil War in Upton's Hill. So for the purposes of the conversation right now, I want to tell you the story of the congressman, the caterer, and the aristocrat. So by now you probably know that the congressman is really Charles Upton, and I didn't know this until doing the research, but you know, he was a congressman. He served briefly in the 36th United States Congress, and he basically had emigrated. Well, he came from Massachusetts in the 1836, and he actually was a graduate of Bowdoin College in Maine, and he was a fierce abolitionist. And why he came down to Virginia, I don't know that story yet. But I did contact Bowdoin College, and I'm hoping to get access to some of his papers, that they have there. But interesting enough, he tried to publish a newspaper in Virginia, and he couldn't. And I'm not sure what was the financials or the cost, but he ended up in sometime in the 1850s, moving temporarily to Ohio, and that's going to play into the story of Charles Upton. And he became a co-publisher of the Zanesville Daily Courier, and it was a very pro-Republican newspaper of the day. And they had a competing newspaper that was very pro-Democratic, and that was called the Ohio Statesman. So for those of you that are from Ohio and are very familiar with Zanesville, it was very close to the Ohio and what we called West Virginia border. And in fact, it was very close to Wheeling, West Virginia, where Charles Upton was a delegate to go to Wheeling when they had the convention, the first convention, and they were trying to create a government in absentia for Virginia, because at this time, you know, Virginia now was mostly under control of the Confederates. So Charles Upton was considered, you know, pretty up there in this group of radical Republicans that were trying to form this kind of de facto absentia government. That he actually ran in a special election, and he was voted in as congressman and started to serve. But lo and behold, there was a congressman from Ohio that challenged his eligibility, because he basically said, well, wait a second, you voted in the Ohio election in November, and how can you then in 1861 run for Congress in Virginia? So it's an interesting bit of history. And for those of you that teach history in Arlington, I dare you to give that as an assignment to one of your students to do a study on Charles Upton. Very interesting character, worthy of a much more retrospect. But I find his story fascinating. And the other thing that I think it's fascinating associated with Charles Upton was that while he was a congressman, even for a very, very brief time, he basically was a pro-abolitionist. He was a contemporary of Lincoln, and he actually was active in the creation of what was then called the DC Compensation Proclamation, which allowed for the freeing of slaves and enslaved people in Washington, D.C. And this actually becomes a part of another story when we talk a little bit about Charles Upton's son-in-law, Hugh Throckmorton, who actually had slaves. And Hugh Throckmorton's uncle, John Throckmorton, ended up being an officer in the 6th Virginia Cavalry. And Throckmorton's nephew, Charles Beaujolais Throckmorton, Charles Upton's grandson, was in the Union Army in the 4th Artillery. So talk about a divided family. It's kind of fascinating. By the way, I encourage everyone, if you have photographs of Charles Upton, of Charles Beaujolais Upton, I would love to get them. I searched and I couldn't find any. So that's something we could talk about later, about public history and collaboration. So again, going back to the part where Upton Hill originally was occupied by the Confederates, it was very strategic, and it became such a prominent location because of the observatory, and just strategically it controlled the movement of what we call Leesburg Pike, Route 7, and the Aqueduct Bridge Road. And as you can see from these drawings, the fort that they built there was a pretty basic, simple fort. And it quickly, when finally occupied by the Union, Upton Hill becomes a pretty significant logistical center. There were churches, there were hospitals, there were commissaries, there was a depot. One of the things I discovered that I think is fascinating is that at the time, the Union Army gave contracts to photographers to follow certain armies. And so there was a photo gallery or photography studio in Upton's Hill. This particular gentleman, unfortunately, he's killed later on in the war, but he took his photograph in Upton's Hill, and he was with the 14th New York Regiment, and this was the Brooklyn Regiment. And they were a pretty well-known unit, especially at the First Battle of Manassas. But again, further down the hill, right where Camp Upton was a train depot. And that's what made Upton's Hill pretty significant for a defensive location. All these supplies coming from Alexandria along the railroad, they could unload them, and then soldiers would come down the hill and be able to pick up the supplies and bring them to the 5 camps that surrounded Upton's Hill. This brings me now to the second personality that I'm introducing today, and that is Captain James Sanderson, our caterer. So I guess any good presentation has to have something about food. And so for those of you that like to cook, I think it's an interesting discussion about Mr. Sanderson. At the time of the Civil War, he was a well-known caterer in New York. And a quick observation about this photograph, this was taken in 1861. It really is interesting to see a perspective of New York City. But if you look to the lower right, you see an American flag and you see a kiosk. That happened to be a recruiting station for the New York militia. And I think it's just interesting in the research to get a photograph of New York City, there was a Civil War component to it. And there you go. You got some people in uniform close by, but you actually have people signing up. And remember now, it became quickly expedient to have people pay other people to serve their quotas and all that stuff. So these recruiting stations became significant, and it's no wonder that New York sent a lot of troops early in the war. But again, Upton Hill Logistics Center, and there's Sanderson, and he's really worried about New York troops not eating well, because who would want to go to this kitchen, right? So this is a typical commissary, and notice how they've built their kitchen in a stockade-like fashion. And he was hearing reports that the New York soldiers weren't getting good quality food. So he signs up, and he decides that he's going to write a book This is a very well-known book, by the way, for us Civil War reenactors. And it's not a very big book, but notice at the bottom or above his name, there's something called the receipt for making bread in the portable field oven. Okay, and notice this funny name, the substance, I'm going to say it wrong, substance department. I mean, talk about an Orwellian term. So he became a captain in that department, and as a result, he comes to Upton's Hill. But what about these brick ovens? And so one of the things that he did when General James Wadsworth comes to Upton's Hill after Confederates withdraw at the end of September 1861, Sanderson is invited to cater a party for the general. And in order to do that, he takes his book to heart and he decides to teach the soldiers how to build these brick ovens. Now, I never really knew about these until I started looking at the book. And by the way, you can download the book and the recipes from my website, so for free, okay? So if you look at these brick ovens, I mean, basically, I was told later on by some of the neighbors living on North 9th Street that some of the older neighbors actually found remnants of these brick ovens right behind the Febrey estate. So we know these existed, but it's just kind of interesting to see what he proposed that they would look like. And look in the upper left, that's a pail. Most of the soldiers were not given cast iron, because who's going to march 30 miles a day lugging a cast iron pail? Those were tin pails, and they were nestled, meaning they would have 3 to accompany, and that's how they would cook. And what did they cook? Well, this is what they cooked. You're looking at Captain Sanderson's recipe of pork and beans, a soup that he promoted. And we make this, modern reenactors, we follow this recipe. And this is something that actually a lot of people enjoy. So there you go. You're looking at a catered meal via the Civil War. So finally, the aristocrat. Well, for those of you that don't know me, my wife is French. And I found this little bit of historic information. I thought this was the most interesting of most of the facts that I discovered. And that was that a lot of French aristocrats somehow thought fighting in the American Civil War was something they needed to do. And this guy, the Comte de Paris, or the Count de Paris, he was also, I believe, known as a pretender to the throne. So this is the time of whatever regime in France, and the royalty has long been gone, but he had a historical connection, and he ended up serving for a year with the staff of George McClellan. And now I'm going to get into a little bit of controversy here, so I'm going to just, for truth in advertising, I decided to use this photograph because it says Upton's Hill on it, but there's another photograph that other historical collections say was from Miners Hill. So I'm not saying that this photograph was taken at Upton's Hill. I'm just saying that someone believed it was, and that's why they wrote it on this image. But I'm throwing it out there. There were people that years ago blogged about the forensics of trying to figure out where this photograph was taken. But George McClellan, either way, this is George McClellan and his staff. And a bit to the right of George McClellan, you can see the Comte de Paris standing there. He's rather tall. And you can see George McClellan, who was, known as the Little Napoleon, was not. And there you have it. I mean, George McClellan, for those of you that are ever studied him, was quite the interesting character. We could talk a little bit more. But this is a photograph is supposed to have been taken by Matthew Brady. And it's rather historic because it does give a snapshot. Some people believe this photograph was taken at the time of Second Manassas. By this time, McClellan had been removed as overall commander, but he still was basically in charge of the defenses of Washington. And according to McClellan's diary, he rode out to Upton's Hill. It's noted in his diary. And while there, he could hear the cannon fire of the battle going on, and ultimately the tragic defeat of General Pope, who was unfortunately entrapped into that second battle. But one interesting thing about the Comte was it gets me to talk a little bit about Thaddeus Lowe and the Balloon Corps. And I think it's important to note that he was all over Upton's Hill. Thaddeus Lowe and the Balloon Corps actually stayed at Upton's Hill for a while. They camped out there and they launched their balloons many, many times. And one of those times they permitted the Comte de Paris and the entourage to go in and fly above. The account was that he went up about 1,000 feet. And from that vantage point, you could see well into Fairfax City. And they were able to see the Confederate, the disposition of the Confederate troops. Interesting enough, you can look at how many men were involved in the operation to launch one of these balloons. By the way, Thaddeus Lowe, very interesting character. He doesn't end the war still in charge of the U.S. Balloon Corps, but he did a lot of things in Arlington that are firsts. And again, Arlington has credit of being the first site of an aerial balloon reconnaissance and also the first site of an aerial balloon being shot at. So we can make a plaque about that too. I find this drawing, we were talking about the train depot and the drawing, this drawing shows that train depot, and it also shows what appears to be, I believe, Aqueduct Bridge, and you're looking at 4 Mile Run, and I think it's kind of interesting. I mean, the quality of the drawing is interesting, a little childlike, as far as the train, but I do think that it does represent, and it does, confirm that there was a train depot there, and the railroad went through it, and one of the things that was significant about that railroad is it played a very important strategic role. And we'll talk a little bit more about the railroad later, especially the bridges that were constantly at threat. That now brings me to a conversation that Annette, if you can bring online my colleague Luke Burke, and I wanted to just once again thank him. Luke was the one that got me familiar.
Luke can just unmute. Luke, if you're out there, I know you're out there, you can just go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yep. Hi, everybody.
Hey, Luke, thank you. I have to give a lot of credit to Luke. He introduced me to Charles Ballou. He was with the 1st Ohio, and like I said earlier, early in the war, especially around mid-June, the Union forces had come in as far as Upton's Hill, and the railroad was very strategic, but the Confederate raiders were destroying those bridges. And the 1st Ohio was tasked by General McDowell and General Schneck from Ohio. He was one of those political generals to protect and guard those bridges. And the drawings that we're seeing here of the bridges over 4 Mile Run. I was going to say Madison County, sorry, but the bridges of 4 Mile Run, look at the simplicity of the truss bridges. Now, I have to tell you, I went around 4 Mile Run looking where these bridges are, and considering that we know that they were camping at Camp Upton. For those of you familiar with the Dominion Hills Park, this is the bridge right by the Dominion Hills neighborhood park. Now, go there and take a look at that, and you'll see on the right-hand side the original brownstone still exists from the Civil War. On the left, the wall was destroyed and it was pushed back further. But I think it's fascinating to go back and take a look at this. And Ohio troops actually camped in the area. They basically were there and dropped off there to protect. And that movement from Alexandria of loading up the 1st Ohio with all those troops led to what eventually became the Battle of Vienna here in Fairfax, June 17th, 1861. And this image shows what happened as they were traveling from Alexandria and stopping at each bridge and dropping off a company of troops. The Confederates, by the time they got to Vienna, were well aware of that, and that battle ensued. And I'm just going to quickly go back to this drawing. Luke, you were the one that brought this to my attention. Tell the folks what this is, what's occurring in this picture.
Yeah, sure. So, like Peter said, Charles Ballou was part of the 1st Ohio Regiment, and he was on the train that day. And they dropped off a couple companies on their way to Vienna, but he was still on the train when they got there. And the Confederate batteries started shooting at the train, and the soldiers all filed off into the woods. And what you see here is Charles, drawing of the Vienna engagement, which is pretty unique. I mean, you don't see. Obviously, you saw the other drawing that Peter showed of the engagement. That was, a newspaper correspondent drew probably after the fact. But that drawing is from somebody who lived the skirmish.
So some of the other, hang on a second. I think but there is actually, this is a perfect example, by the way, of a digital collection. And I didn't post it for today, but because I got so interested in Charles Ballou, I just happened to come across an eBay auction, and someone was auctioning off his discharge papers because he ended up getting very sick. And in 1862, February, he ended up being discharged from his regiment. But that's how much I like this guy. And I really thank Luke for bringing him to my attention. But Luke, stay on for a second, because this guy I found recently, Charles W. Reed. This is an interesting perspective that he drew of Upton's Hill. Many believe he drew this from climbing the tower, and you're looking towards Route 50 from this vantage point, okay? And I don't know if you've already started to track this, but every time someone drew Fort Ramsey, it looks different. There's something different and unique about the fort. So I don't know if they're all drawing the same fort, but they claim that's Fort Ramsey, Upton's Hill, but it doesn't look the same as some of the other drawings. So there might have been an evolution of the forts. I don't know, but it's for someone else to kind of map that. But one of the things that it's important about this guy, Charles W. Reed, who, by the way, was a Congressional Medal of Honor from the Battle of Gettysburg, okay? He was with a Massachusetts artillery unit. And so not only he was an artist, but he was a fighting artist. And he ends up saving his captain, and he got the Congressional Medal of Honor for that. But he is also more known for doing the drawings on a very famous Civil War book called Hardtack and Coffee. And if you really want to know about what life for the soldier was, reenactors get this book all the time, because this is what you want to learn about how they lived. And he holds no punches. He tells it as it is, and it's kind of an interesting perspective of the soldier. But I wanted Luke to be on this because this is kind of what got me going on Upton's Hill research. And Luke, why don't you just tell the story about this image that we're looking at?
Yeah, sure. So Peter, thanks for the opportunity to contribute. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on with this image. What the writing says on it, it's hard to read Civil War era writing in general, and I don't know if it shows up any better on the screen with it blown up. But it says Febrey's house, Secesh, the army in the advance, the encampment of the New York 25th Regiment, Colonel James E. Kerrigan on Upton's Hill, Virginia. And so maybe I'll just take a minute to break down some of that. So obviously, I mean, you've heard a lot about Febrey. And when I first saw this drawing, I mean, it seemed like John Febrey was the most likely candidate. But I mean, if you guys have seen the map of the Civil War at the time, there's 5 or 6 different Febrey houses in the area. So I mean, I thought it was probably his house, but wasn't 100%.
So Luke, I got the modern day picture. If you want to just discuss how you kind of compared, how you probably had to do that a couple of times.
Oh yeah, 100 times. So yeah, I eventually stumbled across another drawing that Peter showed of the camp of the 144th, and so comparing those two drawings and then the various accounts from soldiers and all the different regiments that were stationed on the area, I mean, I came to the conclusion like, all right, yeah, this is John Febrey's house. And for a while, early in the war, folks suspected that he maybe favored the South. I think it was General Tyler, who was in command of the Connecticut regiments on Taylor's Tavern. I guess one of the telegraph wires was cut, and he thought, I don't know if he thought that John Febrey was involved, but in interviewing him, he thought that he was pro South, and it wasn't until I think Hugh Throckmorton spoke on his behalf that he changed his mind. And then after the Confederates occupied the area, John Febrey he went, I think, towards Falls Church to stay with the Shreve family. I think they were cousins, and so when the Union Army reoccupied the area, John Febrey wasn't there, and so they suspected, like, oh, he went towards Southern lines. He must be for the South again. And again, he came back and he talked to General Wadsworth, and neighbors spoke on his behalf, and eventually, his house went out. It served as a hospital for Union troops, and in the winter of 1862 and 1863, they set aside part of the house to take care of sick soldiers from the brigade that was stationed on Upton Hill. Don't want to interrupt. I want to get to this. He filed a petition. If you look at this was either with the Southern Claims Commission, and he had to get people to testify to his unionist status in order to get any money back. But keep in mind, going back here, when you have thousands of Union troops, all of a sudden your wood is going to be gone, your grain, your feed for your animals. There were orchards and other things that were, the nature of soldiers that, took a lot of stuff. And, he lost a lot of money, and unionists or not, he put in a claim and he had to prove himself. So I'm sorry, Luke, but let's get back to this, though. We know that this is no longer there, but I think it's just worth, at some point you had to have that aha moment, right? Yeah, I think we kind of have different perspectives on the orientation of the drawing, but I think at the end of the day, it seemed like, based on the roof line you see there, the shape of the house and the size of that house and the way it's situated towards the road and the foundation, I thought, that portion of the house was built prior to the Civil War. And I wrote a short story saying, laying out all the evidence of why I thought it was, that was pre-Civil War structure, and that it should be preserved. But that's all a moot point now.
No. So Luke, thanks. I got to move on, but I just really wanted to say that your historical background and research is contributing a lot. I think we one of the takeaway points that I would hope the people watching tonight, what happened at 4 Mile Run and those Ohio troops, that's a story in itself. Ballou did us a big favor by capturing some of that, but the first Ohio, how they protected those bridges, how they were, putting different companies along the 4 Mile Run, and to protect those bridges. That was something I think a lot of people just didn't realize was going on from the start of the war. And I think the first Ohio is just a fascinating concept. It was called Camp Upton, by the way, because at one point Congressman Upton was invited to come down to the camp, and as an honor, they named the camp after him. And when he came down there, he brought a captured rebel flag from West Virginia to give to the troops. So there was this connection with Upton in Ohio. So he definitely was playing the Virginia and the Ohio cards pretty well. Just real quickly, I just wanted to share with you some imagery of some of the artifacts over the years that have been discovered. What you're looking at here are a railroad spike that probably was used as a tent stake, or some people have told me that the cavalry would use these to tie down their horses. You're looking at a handle from a cast iron pan. To the left, underneath the railroad spike, that's what's called camp lead. Soldiers weren't stupid. They knew they had to start a fire. They would take one of their rounds that was wrapped up in paper that included the mini ball, and they would throw it in and light it. And that's how they were able to start the fire with the black powder. The end result was the mini balls that you see on the right melted. And you know that you're in a campsite when you find camp lead. And you're looking at the 3-ring mini balls to the lower right, and a round ball, which means that the early troops both had smoothbore and rifled muskets. The smoothbore would have fired that round ball and 3 little pellets, and the round was called buck and ball. We talked about the New York troops that were there. This is a keeper. If you could find one of these things, that state of New York belt buckle, it's a rarity today. Probably not as rare as finding a CS belt buckle. And to the right is one of those militia buttons for the jacket. Again, these things have been found at on Upton's Hill, and it just confirms that there were lots of soldiers there camping there for an extended period of time. We talked about the claim of the Febreys, but it was well known after the battle. The second battle of Bull Run, a lot of Union troops made their way back to the safety of Upton's Hill, and they were tended to and cared for. And the Febreys were like other people in Falls Church and Arlington. They were taking care of these thousands of wounded soldiers. We don't know for certain. Unfortunately, no one had the opportunity to do any ground mapping, but it is believed that on the property, you're going to find amputation pits like they found out in Manassas. Anytime there were medical facilities and hospitals and soldiers are wounded, there's going to be amputations, and you have to have some place to bury those the limbs and appendages. So again, this drawing is really significant when we talk about Upton's Hill, because this is a turning point in the war, and this is where the music needs to come up real full. Lumley, the artist, he was an illustrator, very well-known illustrator. He gave us a very bold title, The Army in the Advance. And he kind of reflected the hopeful nature of the Union in terms of how to bring the fight to the Confederates. And by the way, at the bottom, look at the note, it says the evening parade. So you're looking at a full regiment out in display in front of their officers. And you're looking at about approximately 8 or 9 companies of about maybe 60 or 70 men. And I think it's pretty outstanding that was up the street from where I live. And, you know, every time I walk up McKinley, I just look at this and I picture this in my mind. We talked about
Peter, do you want to take some questions?
Yeah, sure. Why not?
Okay. And also, I know you wanted to show us your website.
Okay, I get it. I'm almost there. I'll tell you what, let me just finish one point and then we'll take some questions, okay?
Go for it.
Okay. Okay, I did want to just give a really quick history about my favorite buddy, George McClellan. Obviously, the defeat of McDowell at the first Manassas, first Bull Run, brings us to this character, Major General George B. McClellan, who gained fame initially because of some small victory in West Virginia at Philippi. And he ends up becoming the father, birthing the Army of the Potomac, which I think alone makes Upton's Hill significant because of where it is located on the front line. And, you know, at the time, you're seeing George McClellan up against General James Longstreet and Beauregard. And, you know, you're seeing this constant, steady, small war going on between the two armies. And this particular person, Lieutenant Newton Colby, is very interesting to read his diary because he talks about what was Arlington's claim to fame as far as military, the Ball's Crossroads skirmish, which took place in the late summer of '61. And as you can see from the map, a lot of Union troops came out, and it just happened to be at the time that the Confederates were doing a reconnaissance in force. And the 4 Mile Run Valley all the way up to Hall's Hill was a lot of fighting involving almost 1,000 troops. And you're looking at where Newton Colby was, right at the bottom of 4 Mile Run, and Bluemont on the left and the Rose Garden on the right. He would have come down this hill, and he was a very adventurous guy, and he was, you know, leading his troops where he was told not to go. And this is his map. That blue line shows where the Rose Garden is, and the yellow line shows what was then the Aqueduct Bridge Road. And I think it's just a fascinating bit of history to read it. You can actually do a Google search, and there's an account of this on the New York Times, and it's actually on my website. And I love this cartoon. It really just kind of shows you what poor Lincoln thought of Major General George McClellan. He was just sitting there staring at the enemy, not doing anything. And my favorite line of the research is that poor President Lincoln, he claimed that General McClellan had the slows. So it was a very frustrating experience between the two of them. And again, another photograph of the New York 23rd that fought in that skirmish. And I think ultimately what saved McClellan is that the Confederates finally decide to withdraw, and then he moves in and he claims victory. This is the only time a general, he didn't do anything to deserve it, but this is a drawing of George McClellan arriving at, I believe this is Munson's Hill, and claiming this immense victory. He writes about it to his wife in his diary, and he basically says, "Thank God I don't have to see that crappy flag anymore flying, and hopefully this is the last time that that was the Confederate flag flying from Munson's Hill, and that hopefully it's the last time that the Confederates ever see Washington." So that being said, I'll tell you what, I'll leave it right here at the Grand Review. This is probably the exclamation point of McClellan. He engineers this Grand Review at Bailey's Crossroad of about 50,000 Union troops, probably one of the largest assembly of troops in the Northern Hemisphere. And I am going to go ahead and accept questions. Go ahead.
Okay. All right, great. So this is way back at the beginning when you mentioned Fort Buffalo.
Yes.
Dana and John were wondering if you could talk a little bit more about Fort Buffalo, where it was, that sort of thing.
If you're familiar with Sleepy Hollow Road, there's the fire department on the right. I think there's a hospital, and on the left was the fort, and people still are finding artifacts from that fort, and it was constructed by New York troops, hence the name Fort Buffalo.
Mm-hmm.
And that came later on after Fort Ramsey. Okay, this was General McClellan very concerned, and he really was trying to beef up the defenses, which came in handy at the Second Battle of Bull Run.
Okay, great. And Craig wanted to know, in your picture where that was posed, where you told us that Washington was on the east, was it to the right? Right.
Yeah.
And then it looks like the cannons at Fort Ramsey were pointed at Washington. Could you explain that picture a little bit more?
Well, understand those forts were outposts. They had to be surround sound. Excuse me. I mean, they had to be in a defensive mode. It's kind of like a fort in the Old West, I mean, you just don't have a front. The whole circle area, you have to assume that you're going to be enveloped. So they had to defend against the entire 360.
Got it. Someone else mentioned that Matthew Brady may have been around there. And you talked about a photographic studio. Would this have been his?
No, those particular I mean, he did take photographs on and around Upton's Hill, or a lot of the people working for Matthew Brady. I mean, a lot of photographs are attributed to Matthew Brady that he didn't take. So that's a whole different historical conversation. But he was the brand. So, and by the way, he had a studio downtown Washington, right near the National Archives. And if you've ever seen the Temperance Fountain, that's right where his studio was located.
Oh.
I think what's important to note at the start of the Civil War, the carte de visits, those CDBs that poor soldier Mallory who died later on. Soldiers are at camp, they're thinking about the future, and they say, hey, if I can get a photograph and send it back to my family, at least they'll have an image to remember. They had just come out about 5 years earlier with a process to make a multitude of pictures with, they would have a camera with like 4 lenses, and that just simplified the process of making these CDVs. They were about the size of a baseball card. And guess what? Baseball cards are a result of Civil War photographs. The origin of the baseball card can be traced back to the Civil War. And by the way, baseball can be attributed, or at least the popularity. Abner Doubleday did not invent baseball, but the popularity of baseball was because soldiers played baseball at the camps.
That's great. Now, you may have mentioned this a little bit already, but if you have any more add to it, that'd be awesome. Patricia wanted to know more about the Dominion Hills encampment.
Dominion Hills encampment. Well, all around Dominion Hills. Oh, you're talking about the bridge on 4 Mile Run. Yeah, I would hope the Arlington Historical Society can help historical researchers get permission to do some metal detecting around there, because I would imagine not far from where the secondary bicycle path meets up with the road, and there's an open lot. I suspect that area was where some Ohio troops camped out to protect that bridge.
This might be a little bit after your time, but Ed wants to know if McKinley Road was likely named for William McKinley. When did we discover that William McKinley was there?
I for a brief moment, I thought the same thing. So kudos for you thinking that way. But if I understand the timeline, the McKinley Elementary School was finished in 1951, and I believe that was the 50th anniversary of the assassination of McKinley. So even back then, naming schools was a challenge. And I think they said, what the heck, poor guy got assassinated. Let's name a school after him. But interesting enough, after the Civil War, some of the people who were, fans of McKinley went to Antietam, where McKinley got an award because he brought coffee and sandwiches to soldiers at the Battle of Antietam. And there's a monument somewhere on the battlefield to William McKinley. But this came about after he was president. So it must not have seemed very important that Sergeant McKinley brought coffee and sandwiches at the time.
Patricia would like to know if when the developer breaks ground at the Febrey site, is there any county regulation that requires that found objects be provided to the Arlington Historical Society? Oh, Patricia, if only that were true. No, Peter, do you have any information about what happens during development when things are found?
As far as the discovery of artifacts, I mean, that's the developer's property. I think we know from what just happened with Febrey that Virginia property rights are very clear. But I do know that if human remains are discovered, then that's a whole different equation. Then a whole bunch of highly trained medical personnel need to come and do the forensics and figure out who they are, when did they die, that type of thing. Yeah. I'm not wishing it upon the developer, but I just they do the math. If you had thousands and thousands of wounded soldiers coming through that area, and several of them got amputated, and there had to be a place to deposit those cut off arms and legs.
Jordan would like to see the Balls Crossroads skirmish map again, and have you describe the troop movements a little bit more.
This map right here.
That one?
Is this the map?
Yes.
Okay, so forgive the crudeness. This was my first attempt at doing a military map, and it's really not for historic accuracy, more for just telling the story. But keep in mind, at the time of August 27th, the Confederates had occupied the high ground. They occupied Munson Hill, Upton's Hill, Miners Hill, and Hall's Hill, I believe, was the objective of their movement. And eventually the Confederates will briefly occupy Hall's Hill, and they will burn Basil Hall's house. I know Arlington's Historical Society has done articles about Basil Hall, and it's fascinating character. I have to say, from a 21st century perspective, I just find it hard for someone to claim that they're a unionist to own slaves, but he did. He claimed to be a unionist, and he did own slaves. But the history of Hall's Hill is probably a whole different matter. I only regret that when they started doing the excavation work at Virginia Hospital, that I didn't pay more attention, because I imagine they must have found a lot more artifacts over there as well. I just think it's important to note that on a daily basis, okay, this is the important part of what I'm trying to educate people. that thousands of Union troops are along this kind of line. And every day, different companies of troops are coming into the 4-mile run area, and their purpose is for reconnaissance. Their purpose is to capture Confederate prisoners. Their purpose is to just see what the movement of the enemy is. Remember now, you didn't have satellites, you didn't have airplanes, you did have balloons, but that still wasn't considered a commonplace usage. And the only way you're going to get accurate intelligence is sending your troops out there. Plus, notice that you're going out and extending about a mile away from the camps are. So if your troops engage the enemy, they're going to fire their muskets, and you're going to hear that. And that gives you plenty of time to mobilize the troops and prepare for an attack. I hope that answers the question.
All right, Tom Dickinson has a comment. He says that if human remains are found on the Febrey-Lothrop Rouse site, there is no enforcement mechanism for reporting any such finds. They could be found and then immediately destroyed and covered over, since there is no inspection requirement on the site.
Yeah, unfortunately, first off, I just want to shout out, Tom, thank you for all your efforts, you and John Reeder. I know I promised myself not to get too caught up in 21st century politics, but this is about history, and this is about preserving history. And, you know, I get it. Property owner wants to do what they want to do with their house. That's great. But history is public. The history of what happened on Upton's Hill is not owned by an individual. It's owned by all of us in Arlington. So I think it's important to forever buys that property. I think they need to recognize there's a little bit of a shared involvement of saving that history in any way possible. And other locations around us, they do a better job of partnering and preserving that history, whether it's Fairfax and Loudoun County or whatever. So again, shout out to Tom for all your efforts, John as well, John Reeder. And again, just one final thing as a shout out, April 17th, I believe the board is going to hear from everyone as to whether the land, not the house, should continue to be designated a historical designation. I still think that's a strong avocation that the land, as you're learning tonight, a lot of history happened. I know most of what I said tonight is Civil War history, but a lot of history happened there. And it's worthy for at least a part of that land to be preserved. So that's my pitch. Thanks, Tom, for the question.
And you answered Nancy's question, who asked the same question about the pending historic designation of the site. So that's great.
A twofer, good.
That's right.
I'm economizing.
Folks, do you have any other questions for?
Well, while you're doing that, let me just get back to another important thing that happened. We talked about the Grand Review, but you know, everyone by now needs to know this if you've ever gone to Upton Hill Regional Park. You know, the Battle Hymn of the Republic, Julia Ward Howe, she goes up to see the Grand Review. And most people believe she went to Upton's Hill to see it from the vantage point of Upton's Hill. If you're going to look at 50,000 troops maneuvering, Upton's Hill would have probably been a good place to watch it. And here she is in a carriage with friends, and they're riding back at night. They're seeing the campfires, and they're hearing these men, the soldiers, singing John Brown's Body. And again, they said, oh my God, it's a horrible song. And her friend says, well, you're a semi-amateur poet. Why don't you write different words? And she goes back to the Willards Hotel, and she wakes up 2 o'clock and writes the poem on the left. I know it's a bad image, you can't see it, but the Bible Museum actually has the original where she penned the verses. And if you've ever read all 3 verses, it's stunning. And I'm thinking to myself, holy cow, I wish I could wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning and write something like this. So anyway, good. I got to put Julia Ward. Oh, and I did want one final thing. There is a huge connection to the Emancipation Proclamation to Upton's Hill. Again, you're looking at a photograph of contraband and enslaved, and a lot of the families on Upton's Hill own slaves, the Febreys and the Throckmortons. And we talked about Charles Upton, contributing to the emancipation in DC. But one of the things that I came out of in my research was what I think one of the most iconic letters that you're going to find coming out of Upton's Hill, and that's a letter from an escaped slave named John Boston. And here he is. He's writing to his wife Elizabeth. We don't think the letter got to his wife, but it did get to the politicians in D.C. And it became a very political memento because they used this letter as part of the case for the Emancipation Proclamation. And this is the letter. Again, that's unfortunately, I left it the way it was in the way it was written. I didn't try to correct it. But here's a man very concerned about his wife, and it's so human. I mean, this is he's basically letting his wife know, and he's now with the 14th Regiment, again the same regiment from the gentleman that was killed, the Brooklyn Regiment. And I just really felt it's important to end here that, you know, I know a lot of people, for whatever reasons, you know, want to minimize what happened on Upton's Hill. But when you read this type of stuff, I mean, holy cow, the saving and freeing the slaves and saving the Union, Upton's Hill played a big role in that. And I'm hoping that any future developer acknowledges that, you know.
So we're reminded that you have a website you want to show us.
Oh, thank you so much. Yes. Okay. For those of you that want the URL,
I put it on. I put it in the chat.
you're the best. I'm Venmoing you $5 for doing that. Right? No, it's a joke. It's a joke. Okay, so I'm a grad student, so don't be too harsh, but this is my graduate project. I'm gonna get graded in about a month. So I'm still going through a process. So your feedback is welcome. Let me just go ahead and stop sharing for a second, and I'm going to go ahead and share again the website itself. And I just want to do I have time to walk people through it?
Sure.
Wonderful. Now I'll answer questions while I'm doing this. So I can.
Yeah. So if you want to unmute and ask questions, that's fine.
Yeah, I'm multitasking. So this is my site. For the last year, I've been thinking about this site, mapping the Civil War in Arlington. The root of doing this is because the previous class I studied about mapping, and I did an exercise on mapping the origin of Union troops from different states and where they ended up in Arlington. And as a result, that got me wondering, well, what the heck? Arlington, a lot happened. I know that Charlie, the guy who writes for Falls Church, he did a similar mapping.
Charlie Clark. Yeah.
Charlie Clark. I'm sorry, Charlie. Apologize. But again, one of the features of the site, it has a map. So it shouldn't be called Mapping the Civil War if it doesn't have a map. And you can search for articles. And again, like here, if you wanted to know about the diary of John G. Morrison, and he was with the 30th New York, and he talks about life camping on Upton's Hill. And you actually can download a copy of a PDF copy of his diary. Another feature of the site is a timeline feature. So for those of you that are just getting excited about the Civil War because of this presentation, I would start here. Look at all the cool things that happened in the Civil War lifetime of Arlington. And I'm not going to go one by one, but I think there were definitely unique moments in history here in Arlington where you want to know the history of Arlington and its impact for those that live. By the way, for those of you that never saw this is a picture of Arlington Mill. It was one of the largest mills on the East Coast. And the wheel itself was like 30 feet diameter. And it was considered a pretty significant industrial point here in Arlington. And the reason why it's not being constructed, in fact, it's being deconstructed. Union soldiers were removing planks for firewood. So again, I told you that the back-end technology is something developed at George Mason University called Omeka, O-M-E-K-A, and the what do you call it? The motif of this is that if you're a museum, you're going to have items, you're going to have collections, and you're going to have exhibits. So for items, if you click on items, there's a list of all the items that I've loaded. Like right now, I've done 161. And then for collections, I made some editorial decisions, and I started to have official documents. By the way, I'm featuring Arlington Historical Society stories, right? So you're part of a collection here, guys.
Thank you.
Yep. And now again, I just did the Civil War related ones.
Sure.
Diaries and letters, books, and newspaper articles is a big one. A lot of newspaper articles. And I got to tell you, read them. They're fascinating. By the way, if you've never read a 19th century newspaper, it's hilarious. All the cures that they were selling on the front page. It's amazing. So another feature. So if there are teachers, watching me tonight, go and check out the resources. I've got websites. These are all the digital collections. These are places to go. If you're teachers, these are really good sources to share with your students. By the way, featuring the Arlington Historical Society. Oh, just for the heck of it, you guys got to check out this site. It's called Animating Matthew Brady. It's actually kind of freaky, but if people know at the time, the photographs of the Civil War were stereo views, so you can create kind of a faux animation. And so I just think this is really fascinating that you're bringing some sort of motion to the Civil War. So it's a cool site to go check out if you ever are looking for something COVID related that you're just going to keep your mind off things. So the other thing, and I'm proud to say that most sites don't do this, but I'm taking a risk here, so behave, guys. I've added a contribution feature. Now, you can't just put something in here and it's going to go automatically, to the site, So this isn't kind of like Arlington Now where people just throw their comments up and who cares. But this really is intended for people who are scholarly and really want to say, hey, Peter, you missed this. This is a primary source that belongs on your site. This is an opportunity for you to let me know, and I'd be more than glad to review it. It's in history, you want to double review, triple review, and I'm welcoming people to do the same thing, for me. What else? Again, resources for teachers. I've started a section on lesson plans that I found in other sites. I know there's a lot more out there, and I'm hoping that eventually I'll be creating and getting people to help me create unique lessons plans for mapping the Civil War in Arlington. Any more questions?
It doesn't seem that anyone has any additional questions from the chat room. Anybody else want to ask anything of Peter personally?
So if you follow up and you have questions, come here to the contact page on the site, and this email will get to me. Okay, contact@mtcwia.com.
Peter,
So
this has been
We've had a question-
amazing. This has been
We had a
amazing.
question about whether or not this presentation will be posted on the AHS website. And yes, the answer is yes. We'll have it posted within a week or so on our website on the video page. So keep an eye open, and we'll be posting it on our Facebook site to let you know that it's available.
So I can't stop telling about history, so I apologize, but this photographs or drawing is fascinating. You're looking, Arlington, another well-known thing is that Arlington was the first theater of war that telegraph was used extensively. So the telegraph eventually replaced those semaphore flags that were flying off the tower. And they had developed some rubberized cable. And so that they just didn't have time to put up telephone or telegraph poles. They would just lay it out. And if those of you that were in the military, that's still done today. These guys with the reels would reel it out, and all the forts were connected, by the way, by telegraph. And Lincoln, the first president, great book. I think it's called Lincoln's T-Mails. It's all about Lincoln in the White House reading real-time accounts of battles as they unfolded by the telegraph.
Peter, thank you so much. You have hit it out of the park.